Welcome to our session this evening. My name's David Jack. I'm from FPWR UK, but of course we're here this evening in the context of PWS Stronger Together, which is a partnership that we've been developing over a number of months, and great to see the results that we've managed to get thus far in terms of bringing ourselves as a community closer together. And our purpose really is to educate, is to spread information, because I think it's fair to say we do live in interesting times. There is a lot of activity going on at the moment in the field of Prader-Willi syndrome research, and we're in the context now of seeing drugs come to certainly trial stage. And the purpose of this evening is to share information in more detail. And I'm delighted to welcome 4 representatives from pharmaceutical companies who are at various stages with drugs which have the potential to help our loved ones with Prader-Willi syndrome. I'm also delighted this evening to welcome Robin Chung, who we'll get onto in just a minute. Robin's on the board of PWSA and is an experienced medical practitioner, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of the context and history of research in Prader-Willi syndrome, because research is what we're interested in, of course, and we're interested in its potential to help, but the process can sometimes feel frustratingly slow. It can feel like there is a lot of hurdles to go through, and certainly one of the objectives of us at PWS Stronger Together is to liaise with authorities, to speak with the regulatory bodies, and trying to do our best to ensure as smooth a transition as possible for pharmaceutical companies and treatments that could help our loved ones in the future. But there are some bumps in the road, and Robin will talk about those in just a minute. In terms of sort of timekeeping, guys, our guests from the pharmaceutical companies will be delighted to sort of deal with questions. We only have so much time, and with regards to that in context, please do put your questions using the chat function. You should see the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom screen that you're looking at, and if you just type those in, we'll deal with as many questions as we can. Should we run out of time to deal with questions, we'll see how it goes. We will gather them all up. Helen is going to be sort of ably assisting me with regards to that. Okay, so I think I have suitably introduced everything. Robin, do you want to sort of kick off?
Sure, that's great. My colleague Lizzie will be handling slides for me as well. So welcome everybody. This is the second of our planned 3 webinars to the PWS community in the UK. And hopefully through the wonders of YouTube and social media, this can be shared around the world later on. In July, you may remember that we hosted a brief webinar about discussing what clinical trials are, why they matter to our community, and the ins and outs of how they work. And tonight, we're delighted to have 4 of the sponsor representatives discussing trials that are coming over to our side of the world for Prader-Willi syndrome. I'm Robin Chung. I'm an adult consultant cardiologist by training based in London, and I sit on the board of PWSA UK as part of the Medical and Scientific Advisory Committee. And we're so pleased to be doing a series of all of these webinars with our partners at PWR UK as part of the Stronger Together campaign. Next, please. So tonight we'll be joined by representatives from 4 of our trial sponsors, Soleno, Acadia, Harmony, and Aardvark. And we'll be hearing about the exciting trials coming across to the UK in due course. Next, please. So I want to just go back and step back in time about 40 years and tell you about where trials were 40 years ago and how far we've come now. This slide is a little graph that is produced by the medical researchers version of Google called PubMed. And it's kind of where our colleagues go to look for what's the latest study on XYZ. And we have a look and search around like we were using Google for geeks doing medicine and research. And what this slide shows is if you go all the way back to around the early 1980s, There was maybe one, maybe two trials, maybe one a year if you're lucky, once every 4 years, for a trial about Prader-Willi syndrome. And then if you fast forward to around 2020, you start to see a bump, and you'll see that there are half a dozen trials for therapeutics in Prader-Willi syndrome. So it's taken us 40 years, but I think our gut feeling now is we are entering an age where a rare orphan disease like Prader-Willi syndrome is enjoying the collaborative efforts of many universities, researchers, medical community doctors, and boutique and big pharma to try and further treatments for our rare orphan disease, which currently has no effective treatment, but the main symptom of uncontrolled appetite and weight gain. Next, please. So again, so we go to the 1980s, and one of the early trials was to test a drug called naloxone on the effect of hunger in Prader-Willi syndrome. And naloxone is a drug which is now used, unfortunately, for the reversal of opioid toxicity. And it's a problem, obviously, that's grown across the world in the last 5 or 10 years. But 40 years ago, it was trialed as a potential treatment in Prader-Willi syndrome. But in the end, it didn't really have any durable effect on weight. So it fell out of fashion, lost popularity, and we moved on to the 1990s, which is the next slide. Again, the 1990s looked promising for a new wave of weight loss drugs. And at the forefront were a pair of drugs headed by the drug called fenfluramine, which is a diet drug which gained mass acceptance and FDA approval. However, as we went through the mid-1990s, there was an emerging safety signal in the landscape that fenfluramine may have had an adverse effect resulting in thickening of the heart valves inside the heart, causing people to have thickened, narrowed, or leaky heart valves, and in some cases, having young people who were on these weight loss drugs being put forward for serious open heart surgery to repair the valves. And so in 1997, the FDA decided to halt marketing approval for fenfluramine, although subsequent large studies, meta-analyses, showed with a large enough telescope, a large enough magnifying glass, it may have been that actually the effect was not significantly different what would have been expected. But again, that was wisdom in hindsight. And effectively, this squashed its potential in Prader-Willi syndrome. Next slide. We moved on to the 2000s, where growth hormone became a mainstay for improving muscle mass and development in Prader-Willi syndrome. But growth hormone, as we know, doesn't touch hyperphagia and doesn't touch weight loss. But some of the studies were useful. They showed us that growth hormone didn't accelerate or worsen scoliosis, so that was an important finding. We went on to other studies looking at hormone balancing agents like octreotide, which focused on one of the hunger hormones called ghrelin. And it showed that octreotide had an effect on the two different components of ghrelin, which can help control appetite. But in the end, this had no effect on actual weight, which was kind of the holy grail or the hard endpoint that we were all looking for. Later on in the 2000s, in 2010, a group of researchers from Cornell tried to look at rimonabant as an appetite suppressant, working on the CB1 endocannabinoid system in 20 Prader-Willi children and adults. They recruited 10 children, and then they realized that there was an excess of new psychiatric adverse effects, mood changes, psychiatric disturbance, hallucinations. And so this trial was unfortunately terminated early, and it was felt going forward that this class of psychotropic or psychiatric active agents would not be suitable for Prader-Willi syndrome. Next slide, please. We come back now to sort of where we're starting, and I think the golden age of Prader-Willi research. Somewhere around the last 5 years, various medical research bodies declared that obesity was a public health epidemic. And so large and small pharma companies began to invest in trials for appetite drugs, and particularly in Prader-Willi syndrome. We had the MET-APT2 inhibitor drug beloranib, which looked quite promising, but unfortunately that trial was halted early because of an adverse safety signal relating to blood clots in Prader-Willi participants. We went on to another drug called AZP531, which was an unacylated ghrelin modulator. But this study, again, didn't meet its primary endpoint. And then we went on to carbetocin, which was founded on the theory that Prader-Willi children or babies are born with a deficiency of oxytocin-producing neurons as part of the hypothalamic underdevelopment. And Mounty Toba's work that neonatal oxytocin may have lifelong beneficial effects in Prader-Willi syndrome. And we know that today, carbetocin will be discussed by one of our sponsors in the later part of this talk. So I won't comment on that now. Next slide, please. And lastly, in sort of the last 3 or 4 years, with the new rising tide of popular weight loss drugs, which are originally designed as diabetes drugs, are a class called the GLP-1 agonists. And one of the early versions of this drug was called liraglutide, and it was actually studied specifically in Prader-Willi syndrome. And as a first-generation, weaker version of a weight loss drug, it did not meet the study outcome for weight loss as measured by a marker called BMI SDS, or a change in BMI corrected for standard deviation. It did show some promise that in certain parts of the study, particularly in adolescents, it may have had an effect on weight after about a year. And so what this trial showed us is, although it failed on its initial success measure or primary outcome, it was shown to be safe in Prader-Willi syndrome. And this drug is important because it's very popular in the press among people who are not diabetic or looking for weight loss and improved heart and health outcomes. But it does carry some side effects, such as gastrointestinal side effects. And in Prader-Willi, this study showed that this class drug is probably safe. Next slide. Yes, and this is where I'm just talking about more about this this study. Sorry, next slide. And then we get to kind of the latest wave of second and third generation GLP agonist drugs, like Ozempic or Wegovy, which is part of the generic drug called semaglutide, and Mounjaro, which is the next generation drug. And one of the landmark studies by John Wilding in the New England Journal of Medicine showed that in obese people who weighed around 100 kilos, semaglutide, over the course of 1 year, showed a 15% weight loss, which was sustained as long as you were on the drug, compared to a 2% weight loss if you were doing diet and exercise and on a placebo version of that therapy. And so this was kind of the blockbuster study that opened the gates for GLP agonists in weight loss and health. Before we move on to our 4 other studies, I can say in the last week that Tony Goldstone from Imperial College has submitted a funding application for semaglutide in Prader-Willi syndrome. So we hope and look forward to more information about the study in the coming months and where it will lead us. Next slide. And so now I'll hand over to all of our drug trial sponsors who are delivering exciting news about 4 of the trials coming across to a clinic near you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Robin. I think that was really interesting, and I think one of the things that really stood out for me was just how, how much we've seen a increase in research in the contemporary era. So lots of promise there, I think. Okay, so moving forward, I'm going to introduce now Mike Huang from Soleno, who's going to talk about a drug many of us, or if not all of us, have heard of, which is DCCR. So, Mike, I'm just going to pass over to you.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all this evening. So I'll give a brief update on the DCCR clinical program. Let's see, do I have control of the slides, or does somebody else have
control of the slides?
Okay, great. So we can move on to the next slide. Next, please. Yeah, so DCCR, or diazoxide choline extended release, is the choline salt of a molecule called diazoxide, which has actually been around for quite some time, for several decades. The parent molecule, or diazoxide, is an immediate release drug, typically given 2 or 3 times a day for a number of other sort of unrelated indications. It is not approved for PWS. On the other hand, DCCR is an extended release tablet given once daily and being developed for the treatment of PWS. And as you can see on the figure on the right, with this extended release profile, we're able to deliver drug in a very sustained, stable, and consistent manner, which allows us to adjust the dose and safely reach target dose levels while maintaining good therapeutic responses. Next slide. So our phase 3 program has essentially been completed now. We have one ongoing study shown here on the far right, study C614, which is currently ongoing in both the UK and the United States. But in totality, the phase 3 program included 2 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled studies, 2 natural history studies, as well as the 2 open-label extensions, of which one is the C614 study is still ongoing at this time. Next slide. So here are the results from the original phase 3 pivotal trial. So this was the C601 study, also known as the Destiny PWS study. And as shown in the middle column, the study did not meet its pre-specified primary endpoint, which was hyperphagia based on the HQCT scale. However, this study was conducted back in 2018, 19, and 2020. And so the early part of 2020, of course, was impacted by COVID. And so when we conducted a post-hoc pre-COVID analysis, we found that in this analysis, all of the endpoints, including the primary as well as all the secondary endpoints, were in fact positive, as shown here. Okay. Next slide. So following completion of the C601 study, patients involved in the trial had the opportunity to then roll over into an open-label extension known as the C602 study. The primary endpoint of the study was again hyperphagia, and it was analyzed at week 52. And as you can see on the left-hand side, at 1 year, we saw a large, about a 10-point reduction in hyperphagia from baseline. This was highly statistically significant at this time point in the study. Now, in addition, because the study was uncontrolled, we, with collaboration with the FPWR, we were able to obtain data from PATH or PWS registry. And using matched controls from this registry, we compared our data at week 26 and week 52 with patients who were from the PATH study who were not taking DCCR. And again, at both time points, we saw large treatment effects, statistically significant at both of these time points. Okay, next slide. Additionally, we also examined behaviors that are common in people with PWS. So we looked at the domains such as aggression, anxiety, depression, compulsivity, other common PWS behaviors using something called the PWS profile. And so at week 52, when compared to unmatched or untreated patients from the PATH cohort, we again saw statistically significant improvements across all 6 of the domains. Okay, next slide. Following completion of the open label extension, we then conducted the C602 randomized withdrawal period. So as the name implies, this was a randomized withdrawal study whereby patients who were at the time active in the open label extension were then randomized to either continue taking DCCR or randomized to withdrawal and then switch to placebo for a period of 16 weeks. This study was conducted with input from the FDA, who at the time requested that we provide additional control data before considering registration or marketing authorization. So a total of 77 patients who are active in the open label extension elected to participate in this trial. Next slide. So this slide shows the top line data from this study. So with randomized withdrawal, we saw a statistically significantly worsening of hyperphagia in patients who switched to placebo as compared to patients who stayed on DCCR. The treatment difference between the 2 arms was 5 points on the HQ-CT scale at week 16. And these results were, again, statistically significant, the p-value of 0.0022 at week 16. Next slide. In addition to the hyperphagia score, we also looked at several secondary and objective endpoints. Across both of the secondary endpoints, which included the CGI-S and the CGI-I, we saw improvements, trends that favored DCCR over placebo, although the results were not statistically significant. However, with the objective endpoints, importantly, with body weight, with BMI, there were statistically significant results favoring DCCR over placebo in just 16 weeks. Okay. And the next slide. In terms of the safety profile, to date, we have now dosed over 100 people with PWS for over 1 year. In total, there have been over 400 patient years of drug exposure to DCCR, including some patients who have now been in this program since 2018 and now are into year 6 and beyond drug or experience with this program. Overall, the safety profile continues to be favorable and is very consistent with our prior experience, as well as the experience of the parent molecule diazoxide. The most common adverse events are shown here, including hypertrichosis or hirsutism, peripheral edema, and hyperglycemia. The overwhelming majority of these cases have been mild or moderate, grade 1 or 2. There have only been 2 unexpected serious adverse reactions, both of which were related to behavior or psychiatric events, which in this population, as all of you know well, is really not uncommon, unfortunately. And both of these patients also had fairly significant prior histories of such events. So finally, next slide. In terms of next steps, so as I mentioned, the program has essentially been completed, although one study is still actively running in the UK. A new drug application has been submitted to the FDA earlier this year in June of 2024. The application is under a priority review with a target action date of December of 2024. So we are about 3 months away or so from a decision from the FDA. The drug as I think we've talked about in the past, does have orphan drug designation in both Europe and the United States, as well as fast track and breakthrough designation in the United States. In parallel, we are working on commercialization, planning, and preparation. As I mentioned earlier, the C614 study is still actively running. And finally, we remained highly committed to bringing this drug to as many people with PWS as we can. We are currently very active in developing our regulatory strategy as well as a submission strategy for places outside the United States, including the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world. And with that, thank you again to everyone, to the participants and families who were involved in the DCCR program. Thank you again for allowing me to speak with you today.
Okay, thanks very much, Mike. That was really interesting. I think there was one question's come in, Helen.
Yeah, there was one in the chat. So is DCCR approved for use in people with PWS? I think you kind of answered it, Mike, but if you just could.
Yeah, sure. So not yet. So the drug is currently under review by the FDA, and their target date for a decision would be end of this year, in December. And then we are currently in discussions with additional regulatory agencies, both in the UK as well as Europe or EMA. And so we'll probably have more of an update in terms of the timing of when drug will be available in the UK, the rest of the world, probably towards the end of this year, once we get a little bit further in those discussions.
Excellent. Okay, thanks so much. Okay, moving on. I am going to move on now to Alana from Arcadia, who's going to take us through our presentation.
Thanks, David. So hello, it's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about the clinical studies for carbetocin nasal spray, which is an investigational treatment for hyperphagia in patients with PWS. So next slide. So first, I'll start with just a brief background. I think Robin already mentioned this earlier, but one of the characteristics of Prader-Willi syndrome is a deficiency of a natural occurring hormone called oxytocin. And it's been found consistently that people with PWS have fewer oxytocin-producing neurons. And in a mouse model of PWS called MAGL2, improvement was seen when the mice were given oxytocin. Next slide. In humans, as you may know, the hormone oxytocin regulates several functions in the body, including hunger, anxiety, social behavior, and bonding. Oxytocin deficiency is associated with hyperphagia and behavioral issues in people with PWS. So carbetocin is an investigational medicine that is very much like the natural occurring hormone oxytocin. But the difference is that it's thought to bind to oxytocin receptors with a greater sensitivity than oxytocin itself. So that means that it's potentially more potent at activating the receptors on cells that oxytocin activates. So with that being said, we're looking at a potential role of carbetocin nasal spray for the treatment of hyperphagia in PWS. Next slide. So some of you may have been aware that there was a clinical study of carbetocin nasal spray for hyperphagia and PWS called CARE PWS that was conducted by a company called Levo Therapeutics. This was a phase 3 study, which means it was intended to produce efficacy and safety results that could lead to an approval by regulatory authorities. This study included 119 participants between the ages of 7 and 19 who were treated with carbetocin nasal spray in one of 2 doses or placebo for 8 weeks. Fortunately, this study failed to achieve the primary objective to show improvement of hyperphagia at the higher dose. However, in a separate analysis, the low dose carbetocin treatment showed improvement in hyperphagia. In January of 2022, the FDA denied the approval of carbetocin for PWS, citing insufficient efficacy at the high dose, and recommended an additional study confirming the efficacy at the low dose be performed. So carbetocin is still an investigational drug, and the safety and efficacy of this drug has not yet been established or approved by health authorities in or outside of the US. Next slide. So Acadia acquired Levo Therapeutics, and we are conducting just that phase 3 study to investigate the safety and efficacy of the low-dose carbetocin for hyperphagia. The goal of the study is to collect data on the benefit and safety of the carbetocin nasal spray to support another application to have the drug approved for use in clinical care. The main study is 12 weeks long, and half the participants will receive carbetocin nasal spray, and the other half will receive placebo. Both will be given 3 times a day, and participants will be randomly selected to get carbetocin or placebo, with neither they nor the doctor nor Acadia knowing which one they're getting. There will be approximately 170 participants, 85 in each group. And enrollment for the study began in November of 2023 and is ongoing in the UK, Canada, and US, and will also begin in some EU countries. After 12 weeks, participants may enroll in an open label extension study, which is another study in which every participant receives carbetocin nasal spray. Next slide. Here are some of the key criteria that must be met for a participant to be eligible to enter the study. The study is for ages 5 to 30 for people who have Prader-Willi syndrome with evidence of a mutation causing PWS, and who have hyperphagia characterized by an increased appetite with decreased satiety accompanied by food-seeking behavior. They cannot have a cerebrovascular disease or a history of brain trauma or epilepsy. If they have started new food-related interventions within the previous month, or if they have participated in another research study with another treatment within the previous 6 months. Other assessments will be done, and the participant's medical history will also be reviewed to determine eligibility. Next slide. So this is a diagram of the COMPASS PWS study, showing the fact that half the participants will be randomly assigned to get carbetocin, and the other half will be randomly assigned to placebo, both nasal sprays, as I mentioned. There will be 5 clinic visits in the study, including a screening visit to check that the participant qualifies, and then up to 3 weeks later, a baseline visit at which carbetocin or placebo is started, and then 3 more clinic visits at week 2, 8, and 12. And then again, here they will have the opportunity to continue into the open label study that can go on for up to 36 months. Next slide. So the COMPASS PWS study has a website, compasspws.com, and this includes more information on the main study and the open label extension. There's also a link to a video on the website that talks about how the study is conducted in further detail. So really encourage you all to check that out. The website also identifies locations where eligible participants can join the study. So you can see the 3 sites in the UK that are active in enrolling, along with their contact information. So those sites are the Royal College, the Royal Hospital for Children in Glasgow, University Hospital Birmingham, and the Royal London Hospital. So if these sites are not in your immediate area and you're interested to find out more or to enroll, we do cover the cost of travel and accommodations to the site. So with that concludes. Thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to talk about the study.
No problem, Alana. Thanks very much for that. It was really interesting. I think we had a few questions come in, Helen.
Yes, we did actually. We had a couple in beforehand as well about this one. So first one is, if you could tell us how recruitment is going. Yeah, how's recruitment going at the sites, and when does recruitment close, importantly as well?
Yeah, so recruitment's going well. We're really seeing an enthusiasm within the community in the US and outside. So we are plugging along. We're probably going to be enrolling through 2025. So still opportunity to get involved.
And there was a couple more. Do we have any more time, David, for questions?
we've got enough time. Keep them coming.
Any idea when the carbohydrate nasal spray may be approved by the FDA? Was another question.
Yeah, that's hard to say right now. We're in the process of collecting data, getting patients enrolled, and then we'll be submitting to regulatory authorities after the study is concluded. So probably more information to follow. I can't really give you timelines right now, unfortunately, but that's why we've set the long-term extension study up to 36 months, giving participants the opportunity to continue on the drug until we can get that approval potentially.
Thank you. And then is there any leeway on age range or a reason why younger or older individuals can't join?
So the age range is, again, this is a study very similar to the one that was conducted by Levo. We've brought the age down from 7 to 5, knowing that there's maybe some participants that have already developed hyperphagia, and it's really the measurement of moderate to severe hyperphagia. So we're given the opportunity to kind of see that change occur. And then we know that adolescents and adults continue to potentially show us symptoms and signs of hyperphagia. So that's where our cutoff was made.
Thank you. And the last question on this one, sorry.
Yeah,
do you have any
it's okay. I think we can take one more. It's a quick one.
Sorry. And the very last one that's come in is, do you have any theories on why efficacy is higher with a lower dose?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think what we've heard from our endocrinology experts is that when a hormone like this is administered, you can have what is called a sweet spot, where higher doses may not actually be as effective as lower doses. So that's maybe what we're seeing here in this case.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that. Really good questions. Okay, so moving on now, I'm delighted to welcome Rachel from Harmony Bioscience, who's going to talk about pitocin.
Awesome, thanks so much, David. Appreciate it. I'm happy to share a little bit of information today about Harmony Biosciences and the study that we call TEMPO. The full formal name of the study here is in big letters in the middle, but I don't anticipate anyone to remember that. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So if you haven't heard of Harmony Biosciences before, we are based outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we have about 300 employees. Our company is looking at treatments for rare neurological diseases like Prader-Willi syndrome. And one of the core tenets of our company that I'm especially proud of is, along with hopefully our innovative work, we mix that with the empathy that we have for the communities that we work with. I've had a chance to work with the PWS community here in the States and internationally over the last 6 years now. And so extremely grateful for all the work that you all do as families and patient advocacy organizations. So a sincere thank you. Next slide, please. Just quickly, I wanted to touch on PWS and sleep disorders. What we're doing here at Harmony with pitocin and the TEMPO trial is a little bit different from what you've heard in the previous presentations. So next slide, please. So in 2022, there was an interesting article that was published in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine, where there was a discussion on the diagnosis and management of sleep disorders and Prader-Willi syndrome. And the paper went into information about how clinical experience is growing, and evidence is suggesting that sleep disturbances are common in people with PWS. And if you care for someone with PWS, this may sound familiar to you. While clinical focus has been largely on central and obstructive sleep apnea, other sleep abnormalities in PWS include excessive daytime sleepiness and narcolepsy and cataplexy-like phenotypes in people living with PWS, as well as insomnia. And so this is actually what we're studying with pitocin in a clinical trial. And one of the interesting things that also mentioned in this paper is that healthcare providers and really everyone should consider the impact of the potential relationship between these sleep abnormalities and other features of PWS, such as behavioral concerns. Next slide, please. So why are we studying pitolisant in a clinical trial for PWS? Next slide. So just quickly, a little bit about PWS and pitolisant, and this has been mentioned before. So PWS is a disorder of hypothalamic dysfunction. So as many of you know, the hypothalamus is the area of the brain that's responsible for critical functions such as hunger and satiety, sleep, wake, release of growth hormone, endocrine functions, metabolism, body temperature. And what the hypothalamus does is it regulates sleep-wake stability via hypocretin and the histamine system. And so what histamine neurons do is that they promote and stabilize wakefulness. And so the very layman's term way of describing this is if you take a Benadryl or an antihistamine, what happens? You get sleepy. So if you work to promote and boost histamine in the system, you should, in turn, see additional wakefulness. And so what pitolisant does is that it increases histamine levels in the brain, and we're studying it to see if it helps improve excessive daytime sleepiness, as well as some other symptoms of PWS that may be have a correspondence. Next slide, please. So we did already complete a phase 2 trial in Prader-Willi syndrome that you may have heard of here in the United States. So a phase 2 trial, without getting too into the weeds, is done to obtain preliminary data to see whether the drug has the potential to quote unquote work. So it's called a signal detection study. So we collect safety data, including adverse events of the drug. And we did complete as Harmony, a phase 2 trial in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And we did see positive preliminary data, or what we call a positive signal, supporting further study of pitolisant for EDS and other symptoms of PWS. And this data was reviewed by the FDA, and it helped them guide how we have now put into action our phase 3 study for pitolisant, which we call TEMPO. So next slide, I'll share a little bit of information about that. Next slide, please. So the objective of the TEMPO study, which is our phase 3 study following the phase 2 for pitolisant, the primary objective, we are looking at excessive daytime sleepiness in PWS, which I was just talking about, but we're also looking at whether or not other symptoms are impacted by pitolisant. So that includes severity of irritability, severity of disruptive behaviors, and hyperphagia. Next slide, please. So just high-level inclusion criteria for this trial, male or female, 6 years or older at the time of screening. You must have a genetically confirmed diagnosis of PWS. If you do not have that for your loved one or your child or yourself, that can be done at a trial site. You must have excessive daytime sleepiness at both your screening and your baseline visit, and those are measured by a series of measurements that we are using in the clinical trial. And this is really important. You must have a consistent parent or caregiver, preferably the same person throughout the study. Next slide, please. And here's some key exclusion criteria. So if you've previously taken pitolisant, either in a clinical trial, off-label, you would not be eligible for the trial. If you have a diagnosis of sleep apnea that is not adequately controlled, so you can have sleep OSA and participate in the trial. It's something you'd have to discuss with the investigator in the trial, but you can't, if you're not having it controlled, that could exclude you from the study. You can't be participating in another clinical trial for an investigational medicine. You have to be on a stable dose of current medications or discontinue prohibited medications. And you must experience less than a required amount of sleep per night based on age and data that we're screening for in our e-diary screening process. So this is not a comprehensive list of inclusion/exclusion criteria. You can always follow up with me or a trial site to get the full list. Next slide, please. So quickly, study highlights. We are recruiting right now in the United States. We are hoping for approximately 134 participants. We'd like to hopefully have about 60 from the United States. We have 12 sites open and recruiting in the US and are on the precipice of opening our global site. So our Australia and UK sites will open first, some as early as the 4th quarter of this year. I will share those sites with you on the next slide. And then, as I mentioned, an active caregiver is incredibly important for this study. And the duration of this study is about 4 to 6 months for the time where you'll be either taking pitolisant or placebo, and then an open label extension following. Next slide, please. So these are our planned trial sites in the EU and the UK. I did mention and bolded here our sites in the UK. We will have 4, and they will be opening towards the end of this year and in the early part of next year. And our EU sites will be opening in 2025. And that's it for our team. You can always reach out to me. I am advocacy@harmonybiosciences.com. And you can also reach out to our clinical operations team at clinicaltrials@harmonybiosciences.com. We're happy to respond to emails and follow up. So thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Helen, was there any questions came through?
Yeah, there is one question actually that we had beforehand on this one. So hi, Rachel. The question is, can I enroll my daughter into this trial even if my sleep specialist hasn't necessarily recommended it? Do we have
100%. 100%. So when a trial site open, you do not have to be a patient of the trial site in order to enroll in the clinical trial. So when a trial site opens in an area that you are interested in, please reach out to the site directly, or you can reach out to us at Harmony and we'll help put you in touch. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you. And the other question really as well was, how do you actually measure if someone with Prader-Willi syndrome has excessive daytime sleepiness? I know you touched on it, but I don't think a bit more information would be great.
Yeah. So when you get in touch with the trial site and are interested in the trial, we'll have a screening period. And so you'll have to come in person for the screening visit. And then the screening, there will be a sleep diary that you will keep as a caregiver or loved one for your loved one living with PWS. Depending on the trial site and your child or loved one, the sleep diary could be taken for a period of as low as 2 weeks or up to a month. So you'll stay in touch with the trial site as you're completing your sleep diary. And then if you qualify, if your child or loved one is deemed sleepy enough, that is when you would return for a baseline visit and start begin the clinical trial. So there will be a period where we will measure to make sure your loved one is sleepy enough.
Brilliant. Thank you. David, do we have time for another couple or?
Maybe just for one more.
Okay. How many visits will be needed in the 4 to 6 months?
Yeah, 5 visits. But so the screening visit that I just mentioned is an in-person visit where you must go. The baseline visit is a visit where you must go. And then there are 3 additional visits after that.
Thank you. There are other questions, but we'll respond to those after the webinar.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.
No problem. Thanks so much. Okay, and now I'm delighted to welcome Tian Lee from Aardvark, who's going to talk through ARD 101.
Thank you very much. Really great to be here. Very happy to share the story for Aardvark. Next slide, please. So we have a unique drug as the first in class. We're hitting bitter taste receptors. So taste receptors are actually existing beyond your oral cavity. They're actually highly expressed in the gut. Generally, they're a toxin warning system for your body. Our drug, I believe, is intrinsically relatively non-toxic, but it triggers this adaptive response. Has a few unique properties. You're not meant to taste the drug. It's coded so you don't have subjective awareness of the bitter taste, but it is hitting the bitter taste receptors in your gut. It's largely gut restricted, so the drug is largely retained in the gut, but it works systemically by triggering gut-brain signaling, which induces satiety responses in your brain. And I'll just speak to that in a little bit. But basically, it's an oral drug that's taken twice a day, and it is meant to abrogate hunger as opposed to appetite. And I'll explain a little bit further as well, too. Next slide, please. So our company is looking at the thesis that appetite and hunger are actually different axes of behavior drive. Your behavior as an organism really is a result of both appetite and hunger working separately. In general, appetite is a pleasure-seeking drive, and hunger is a pain avoidance drive. So For instance, if you like chocolate cake, that's appetite inducing you to eat chocolate cake. If it were to turn to dog food, most people wouldn't elect to eat that. But if locked in a room with just that to eat, eventually hunger will drive and compel someone to eat that dog food, essentially. And we believe that the mechanism behind the hyperphagia in Prader-Willi is driven much more by hunger than by appetite, and that is regulated by gut-brain CCK signaling. And by restoring intrinsic gut-brain signaling with CCK, we think we'll have a very good chance of reducing that hunger drive in Prader-Willi individuals. Next slide, please. So we actually, chose Prader-Willi syndrome as a therapeutic target after we elucidated the mechanism of our drug, because we thought it was very congruent to what our drug does. 32 years ago, Tony Holland elucidated that Prader-Willi individuals actually have a baseline CCK secretion that's generally at par with normal individuals, except normally food triggers greater expression of CCK, but that is compromised in Prader-Willi individuals. So with the same proportional induction of food, there's less of a proportional rise in CCK, which is why individuals don't have the normal satiety response to food ingestion, and they stay hungry even despite eating more and more. If you knock out CCK receptors in animals, they actually display very hyperphagic eating behavior. But more than that, the other hints that led our company to pursue this is that CCK also regulates gut motility. It also relates to gallbladder contraction. It's associated with preservation of lean body mass as well. And also it has some anti-anxiety role to play in terms of its correlation with when folks are missing that gut-brain signaling in other circumstances as well too. As we know, Prader-Willi individuals have problems with gut motility. They have a very delayed gut transit time. They get gallstones at an earlier age. They also have a higher proportion of body fat percentage, even at the same BMI. And there's also an anxiousness that's pervasive in a lot of Prader-Willi individuals. So a lot of this gives us confidence that restoring gut-brain signaling through CCK may be therapeutically useful. Next slide, please. CCK actually has been thought of as a therapeutic strategy before for the better part of 30 years. Other approaches have generally used a CCK analog, so something like how they approach GLP-1, having an artificial construct of CCK that doesn't get broken down. But the issue with this strategy with CCK is you have a lot of on-target, off-tissue effects. So if you hit CCK receptors everywhere, then you have other issues of neurotoxicity and pancreatitis. But we believe we get away from this because our drug is locally concentrating. So it's hitting bitter taste receptors on enteroendocrine I and L cells in the gut, in the inside of the gut, and it induces localized secretion of CCK in the perigut region. So anatomically, we're restricting where that CCK is largely expressed, so we believe, a lot of the on-target off-tissue effects, and we selectively induce this gut-brain signaling, and it's hitting the brainstem to therefore convey the anti-hunger or satiety effects of the drug. Next slide, please. We've had now this drug ARD-101 given in normal healthy human volunteers, obese patients, post-bariatric surgery patients, and Prader-Willi individuals, and we've had no serious adverse events. We've had no, we don't presume to have additive side effect risk as much as other drugs because it doesn't require liver or kidney clearance because it's gut restricted, and we don't have any evidence of immunosuppression of our drug as well. Next slide, please. And we actually had a low dose trial that had a portion of that was completed. So we had 2 different clinical sites, 12 patients with Prader-Willi syndrome, and this was an open label single arm study. And in that study, 11 out of 12 individuals had a reduced HQ-CT score as measured, and 4 patients had near complete resolution of their symptoms of hunger. We also saw reduction in body fat percentage in DEXA scans, and also observed findings of reduced anxiousness and other benefits that we seem to have seen in that earlier part of the study. We've now looked at higher doses, and we're completing that extension trial shortly. And we are now focused on conducting a pivotal trial in multiple sites that's multinational which will hopefully be the registration trial for the drug. And we think that we will be able to achieve this within the course of about a year, with the targeted completion date of this trial by the beginning of 2026. Next slide, please. And I also want to show ghrelin, the hunger hormone. Although it has issues as a therapeutic target, we believe I think it's also a very good indicator of hunger state. Generally, the higher the ghrelin you have, the more representative of hunger. Prader-Willi individuals have higher than normal ghrelin levels. This is data from obesity patients, not Prader-Willi patients, because we didn't look at that in our Prader-Willi patients thus far. But in the obesity trial, this is our randomized placebo-controlled trial. In general obesity patients, we saw a reduction of ghrelin as compared to placebo, measured two different ways. One was post-fasting on the day 1 of dosing, and then another one is comparing day 28 versus starting. And even though the ARD-101 patients had lost weight relative to placebo, they had a lower ghrelin level relative to their starting point as opposed to the placebo patients. So that gives us assurance and confidence that we are actually mechanistically affecting hunger. Next slide, please. And also, I wanted to go over what we saw. So the data that we have shared before publicly is 200 milligrams BID twice a day, basically. And we are going to go for 800 milligrams twice a day. We think the drug is very, very safe. So the therapeutic index of the drug is extremely high. So we're not worried about bumping up against toxic limits of our drug, even at higher doses. And preclinically, this is animal data, shows us that higher doses should do better than lower doses. So we're very encouraged by this. And our pivotal trial will be testing placebo versus 800 milligrams, a higher dose than what we actually presented in our earlier data. And I think that's the last slide. Next slide. Okay, yes, great. And then we've had orphan drug designation, rare pediatric disease designation. And as mentioned before, we're encouraged to conduct this pivotal trial that we hope to be starting shortly. Any questions? Hopefully I was within time.
You were. That was great. Thanks so much.
Yes, we have a couple of questions, if that's all right, Tian.
Yes.
So does ARD-101 affect gut motility adversely? I don't know if you could explain that term as well.
Oh, sorry, I missed the question. I couldn't hear. Must be my audio.
I think it's from Robin. Does ARD-101 affect gut motility adversely?
Oh, no, actually quite the opposite. We think CCK is pro gut motility. So we actually think that given the mechanism, it may help with the constipation and gut motility issues in Prader-Willi syndrome. Although we didn't look at that explicitly in our earlier study, mechanistically, we think it actually may address the slower gut transit time based on the mechanism of our drug.
David, do we have time for another one? Or?
Yeah, got time for
Okay.
another one.
And is there anything that the PWS community can be doing right now to support? I mean, that's really to all the wonderful sponsors on the call, but Tian, if you could, is there anything that we could be doing right now with regards to the trial?
Yeah, I mean, we would love to have active participation in enrollment of the study. So when we get ready to move ahead officially, it would be very helpful if the community were to recognize the clinical sites that would be open and facilitate rapid enrollment. We're very eager to complete this trial with the targeted recruitment as soon as possible so that we can actually get closer to seeing those endpoints.
Fantastic. And again, how do you enroll? There's a few questions. I'm going to roll them into one. How do you enroll on the trial, and what stage are the drug trials at for ARD-101?
Yeah, so for Aardvark, we're going to announce soon when the official start of the first open site will be, and then once we'll announce this, we want to run as rapidly as possible. So we're positioning to enroll as fast as practical. So for now, that's all we can say. But we are very motivated, and we actually just completed sufficient funding to complete this trial. So we're just in execution mode right now.
Fantastic. That's great. And I know from PWS Stronger Together side, we will be letting the community know about any trials that are coming here and with the sites that are opening as well. So hopefully that answers Penelope's question as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd just like to thank all the guest speakers this evening. Thanks very much for sharing your information with us. I thought it was fascinating. Really, I think, dare I say, exciting, and not to mention interesting developments. And thanks, Robin, for giving us that historical context at the start. And it's really good to see how things are moving forward and continue to move forward. It is a community effort. And I think one of the great things about the PWS Stronger Together group is that we really are pulling our resources together, we're pulling our efforts together, and that's what it's going to take as a community as we move forward. So please do continue to support what we do. Please do continue to look out for further webinars, and our contact details are there if you want to get in contact with us with any further questions. And otherwise, I think, Helena, I've covered everything that I needed to.
I think that's fantastic. Yes, thank you so much. Any other questions, please let us know.
Absolutely. Yeah, please do get in touch with any questions, and we'll always do our best to get an answer. Okay, guys. But have a good evening, and thanks very much for your time. Okay, take care.